Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's early on the last day of our summit. Thank you for coming for this session. As I said, it will be one of the more interesting sessions. It will probably be the most interesting session, no doubt. And what we'll be talking about is an issue that has been addressed in a number of different other sessions at this summit, but not directly. And that is how do governance frameworks deal with rapidly changing business models that are rolling across just cities, but also countries as well. These business models are facilitated by changes in technology. They have become something that consumers, as we just saw when I asked how many people have been using at least one of those business models, consumers are quite eager to use and happy to use and gain value from. But it's also an area where regulators have been challenged, partly because of the speed with which these services have arrived, and partly because of the speed with which they are able to regulate. And there are good reasons for not being able to regulate too quickly in certain circumstances. But today we have a panel that will talk about how we can go forward from here. How can we move forward to better regulate, effectively regulate, fairly regulate, and in some cases deregulate the way in which we deal with many of these new business models that I should stress are not just coming across in cities, but are also coming across in other sectors, in aviation, in maritime, and in rail transport as well. For that, we have an expert panel that we've assembled. I'll briefly introduce them, and then we'll start a discussion with some questions that I have for them, a few follow-up questions, and then we'll turn it over to the room for some of your questions that you might have. Before I introduce them, I'll introduce myself. My name is Philippe Christ. I'm with the International Transport Forum. As you've seen from some of the publications that we've put out this year and the past few years, this is an area that we have been asked to work in quite a lot by our national governments. And if I were to put it kindly, when we were first asked to work in these areas, how do governments deal with new business models, it was with a strong sense of urgency by our national governments. To put it more colloquially, many of them were freaking out because of things they had not expected, but they were expected to try to adopt their regulatory structures for. And in this area, we have been trying to give suggestions, especially on principles, on how to address these changes. And so that is where the International Transport Forum fits into this question. Now, in this panel, we have a number of people that represent both sides, the regulatory side and the business side. I'll start with Michael Kramer. Michael Kramer is a member of the European Parliament. He's a member of the Committee on Transport and Tourism, and for several years, the head of that committee. We have Raj Rao, who is the CEO of Ford Smart Mobility. At the Ford Motor Company, anyone who's reading the news knows that this is one of the companies that is pushing forward most in this area, trying to develop new services and new responses from the business side for what we see changing in mobility. Salita Reynolds is the general manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transport and is also the president of NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, national being the United States, but in fact North America, since you also have some Canadian members. And Scott Striner is the chair and CEO of the Canadian Transportation Agency, an agency that is undergoing a review of its own regulatory processes and methods in the areas where it regulates, especially in rail, aviation, and maritime. And finally, Roland Werner, who is the head of government affairs for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland for Uber, and interestingly enough, as of not too long ago, State Secretary at the Saxony Ministry for Economics, Work, and Transport. So Werner comes to us with experience on both sides in the same package, and that'll be fascinating to hear about. I will ask a first question about vision, and I'll ask that question to Michael Kramer. Because one of the things the EU has been able to mobilize in Europe, but that has also been a model for other regions of the world, is a vision of where we want to go. Where should governance be heading? And so, Michael, can you give us a sense of your vision of where we should be heading in terms of broadly mobility, but more specifically in how we govern mobility?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, in the future, we want to save mobility and the climate. And of course, we know now the United States, with Donald Trump, he said, no, climate change is not a problem, America first, but we have to look at it. And especially climate change and transport is very important because the transport sector is the only one where we have an increase of the CO2 emissions since 1990. We have a decrease in the industry by 38% and in the housings by 24%. And in the same period of time, we have an increase of the CO2 emissions in the transport sector by more than 20%. So the transport sector is nullifying all the efforts we have done with billions of euros of our taxpayers in other sectors. Therefore, without a change of mobility, we can't fight against climate change, but that is necessary that our children and their children will have a perspective to live on this planet. And therefore, we can see if it is so bad, the figures, we have to change. And where are the problems? And especially in the cities, we have big problems, because in cities, transport is responsible for 70% of all the emissions which are harmful to the climate. So if you look at it, for example, taxis in the cities, they have public spaces. But if you have car sharing communities, car sharing, you didn't get a space for your car sharing. That is crazy, because the vision is not more cars, but more mobility, and that is possible. And I will quote the mayor of Munich. He did it 45 years ago. He said, "The car is murdering our city. The one who sows roads reaps traffic." If all the cars are electric or automatic, if all the power is done by renewables, the murdering of our cities will continue. Therefore, we have to change mobility. And a car is not driving 23 hours a day. I always say no capitalist is buying a machine which only runs 1 hour a day. But that is done with cars. And therefore, we can change it and to use it more. And that are the new possibilities for the cities, of course, in the country as well, that we have to change. I made one single problem. And another one, I can tell you, the transport ministers of Europe have made a roadmap bicycle in 2015 in Luxembourg. And in this roadmap, you can find that more than 50% of all the freight transport in European cities can change to cargo bikes, electric cargo bikes. They can transport 250 kilos. Imagine Leipzig, Berlin, London, Paris, 50% of the freight transport is gone. That is the vision, and no customer can use it. But for these models, we need new regulations and so on. And that is absolutely necessary. Perhaps the last sentence, we need a fair competition. You know, the road package is now done by the Commission, but we have a rail package, and each locomotive, each train has to pay a toll on each kilometer of track. On the road, it is a free will of the member states, mostly only on highways. So 1% of the road is tolled in Europe and 100% of the rail. So politicians are making the environmentally friendly rail very, very expensive, and the climate damaging road less expensive. That is crazy, because in the transport sector, the emissions are done by 72% on road. Therefore, also this we have to change. We need at least a fair competition.
So I get the sense, and it's not just a sense, that you are saying that the regulatory structure, the regulatory signals that are going out are pushing the wrong solutions, at least in terms of dealing with climate and dealing with the environmental impacts. I'm going to turn to Salida. Salida, your city has, or your Department of Transport has put out a framework that I have to say is one of the more forward-looking frameworks that we've seen around the world in trying to deal with how to align what is happening in business, what cities want, and many of the impacts that, that Michael just talked about, but in addition to some of the impacts that relate more to congestion. And that framework you rolled into a document, The Urban Mobility in a Digital Age. Can you tell us about how you propose on your plan, the city's plan, for dealing with these changes going forward, can realign some of the signals coming from governments to try to address some of the issues that Michael has just raised?
Yeah, it's a good question. Really, that work that we did, that we released last year, came out of Mayor Garcetti's Sustainable City Plan, which is one of the most aggressive in the United States. And even though at the federal level we seem to be confused about the science behind climate change, Mayor Garcetti and Governor Brown from California are not, and have clearly stated that California and Los Angeles will remain a part of that multilateral agreement, because really the solutions to resilience of the planet have to come from cities. And so, you know, one of the things that the mayor put out in that plan was that we wanted to get to a 50-50 mode split between single occupant vehicles and non-single occupant vehicles. And, you know, right now we're somewhere around 75 or 80% single occupant vehicles in Los Angeles. So how to transform, radically transform the way people move in Los Angeles, and to do it very clearly up front, stating why. You know, what is our vision? What are the outcomes? Technology and transportation should serve the city and not the other way around, which is the way that we have been building infrastructure and sort of not regulating. So we wanted to put out a vision for how to give people choices. So it starts with a shared open data platform. It shifts the focus to something that we branded transportation happiness. So how can we change the sort of user experience for how people get around our city? Third, it asks us to really radically re-envision partnerships. So instead of being the main sort of entity that delivers all of the public transit, how can cities be a convener? How can we make sure that we are being smart concessioners of public transit? And how can we sort of redefine public transit so that when I say public transit, I mean bike sharing, car sharing, on-demand microtransit, and so on. Fourth, how can we get to a place where we are pricing transportation infrastructure the same way that we price infrastructure that delivers water or electricity? Because we do not expect that twice a day the lights in this room won't work. But twice a day our transportation system fails because we haven't managed demand and priced it appropriately. And then last, how can we get to a fully autonomous public transit system? So that is really sort of and each of those has short, medium, and long-term actions for us to do. If we think that autonomous vehicles are going to be on the streets in our cities by, pick a year, 2021, 2025, who knows, then what do cities need to do now to prepare for that? Because autonomy by itself actually makes mobility in cities considerably worse. And so as regulators, we have a role to play in ensuring through both pricing and delivery and a vision in making sure that those things don't sort of, that we don't see an increase in congestion and long trips because of technology and transportation. What it's really about is not computers, and not technology, but about public policy and about a city for people.
So we're talking about vision still, and I think clearly that's one of the elements of governance is you have to know where you're going, and you have to know what is going to motivate action, both on the government side, but also what motivates citizens to support governments. Raj, when I asked for some points that you would want to bring from Ford Mobility's perspective, one of the points was interesting because this was the question, what risk does poor or no governance for transportation innovation pose for companies like yourselves, but also for the well-being of streets? So can you give your perspective on what happens if you don't have the right framework to innovate in?
So when we started the mobility experiments 4 or 5 years ago, we were very fixated on how do we improve the efficiency of transport. But I think one of the things we discovered is we don't have the voice of the biggest stakeholders in streets, which is the people that live in the city. And we instead focus a lot on people that want to move about. So we launched something called the National Street Service. And we started putting a price tag on all the decisions that have been made through governance and through permitting and everything,
Can you explain that
Yeah,
specifically?
sure.
Because
Yeah.
that's a very compelling image.
Uh-huh.
That,
Yeah. So when we did a survey of several cities, including Salidas, and we started counting all the parking meters that were in the city, and then we started investigating what does it cost a city to maintain a parking meter. How much loss of revenue have businesses encountered because the city or somebody took away a street parking and people weren't able to access the stores. We started investigating what happened with gentrification. So when we looked at all of that, we discovered a decay in street values. That we noticed that people were being strangers. Salida talks about transport happiness. I think that equates also to street happiness. That a lot of people in the city were being confrontational with the city. There wasn't a sense of collaboration between the citizens of a city and city government. It seemed to be very confrontational, and processes to make decisions get lengthy as a result of it. So we launched that service because we felt we had to get the voice of the city and had to get the voice of people living in the city to ask for them what are the aspirations they have, what impact does gridlock have on them and their well-being. We talk about bike sharing, where to put the bike sharing racks, how to price bike sharing, what kind of mobility options they need. So getting the voice of the citizens, I think increasingly we know they love demand responsive transit. That's a given. So they love Uber, they love all these things. But when a vehicle comes and blocks a street for 20 minutes because it's making a goods delivery, what impact does that have on safety? Mm-hmm. So we started looking at how many accidents are taking place around these street corners and what causes that to happen, and what decisions can be made to reduce that, make streets more safe. You talked about pollution, what impact is that having on people's lives? So I think by studying all this, we are able to have a more holistic view of vehicles on streets and how they should be governed and equated back to getting cities to be more livable. Mm-hmm. And when we put out the City of Tomorrow vision earlier this year, one of the things we wanted to emphasize is the human element. So we call it the design gap. So you think about AVs that are coming soon, whether it's 3 years from now, 7 years from now. I mean, these technologies that are in these vehicles today surpass anything we ever had before. They can practically drive themselves. But when you think about the experience you have with transport, it's decayed to a point that you can't enjoy these vehicles. And I think that's why millennials don't want vehicle ownership. And then the other thing we studied also is dwell time and occupancy. So when we look at shared transport, we find that companies will pick up one passenger and drive when the vehicle has capacity of 4 or 5. And these vehicles take up the same space as a microbus, which can hold 14, 18 people. So we're not sure that governance should allow that to happen. That there has to be a way to shift behavior more towards shared pooled rides versus shared individual rides. There has to be a trade-off between convenience and good corporate citizenship. So I think these are the shifts that we are seeing through that service that we have been launching in more cities now to really get a street-level view of what the issues are and be able, it's hard work because city by city, every city is different. But I think once we have that insight, I think then we can plan how to partner with cities to empower citizens to take control back of what kind of streets they really want to have. Mm-hmm. What kind of vehicles do they want to see the streets have to tolerate, so to speak. And I think, to the point about first mile and last mile, I think last mile is being solved really, really well. I think first mile is being ignored. I think a lot of cities are putting trunk lines in for buses and trains, which are very green, but people can't reach them. So they're having to take their own vehicles in, and that doesn't solve the problem, right? To your point, vehicles are being left there for 23 hours a day without being used. It's just adding congestions. I think we have to solve first mile as much as we solve last mile. And the economic impact, I have a story that, we have a service in San Francisco called Chariot, and one of the things we noticed is that for people working on Pier 39, which is a famous pier in San Francisco for tourists, it's very accessible, very easy to get there. But for the people coming from Oakland who work there, There's no BART service. The BART brings them to Embarcadero, which is 1.5 miles away. There's no public transit from there
Done that.
to Pier 39, and people have given up those jobs because it takes away 45 minutes of time to get there. So I think, these kind of issues, these what's called transit deserts, they actually transit micro deserts. It's not the obvious white spaces we see. It's really small journeys that people aren't prepared to pay $6 to $8 per mile to travel, because that's what they earn per hour, half of what they earn per hour. So there's no way they're going to be able to do that. And cities are forcing lower income people further and further away. Because these cities are attracting millennials who get great tech jobs, they're well paid, they want to enjoy the city, they're throwing out all the people that can't afford these cities anymore, and they're moving further and further away, and they're bearing the cost of the cities being urbanized. So I think that balance is not sustainable at all. And that has to be addressed as well.
I think that last point about equitable outcomes and how does governance deliver equitable outcomes is a really important one. We'll come back to that. One thing I also liked about what you just said is that you've made it clear, as Salita did as well, that there's a link between the governance structure for services and businesses, but then the physical infrastructure layer of a city, and how we might have to think about reallocating space and rethinking the way in which cities organize, the way in which that space is used and allowed to be used. But it's not just about cities. And so I'd like to turn to Scott Steiner and ask you, because your agency right now is undergoing a regulatory modernization process, looking at the rules that you have in place and looking at the rules that probably are best adapted for the mandate that you have. So can you describe, from a process level, how does an organization like yours deal with regulatory modernization when the targets are moving so quickly?
It's a very good question. I'll just start by emphasizing, you already sort of noted it in your introduction, but we at the Canadian Transportation Agency regulate at a national level. So in our case, we're talking about aviation, we're talking about interprovincial and international rail services, and about maritime services. And we have, as you noted, launched a very ambitious regulatory modernization initiative where what we've decided to do is to put every regulation that the agency administers on the table for discussion. So just a bit of the background to this. Really, the impetus is very much along the lines that you've suggested and that sort of frames this panel. We realized that the suite of regulations that we're responsible for had effectively fallen, in some cases, out of date, that they hadn't kept pace with emerging business models. And one of the sort of obvious expressions of this was the number of times every month that we needed to issue an exemption from some regulatory requirement because it simply didn't make sense anymore in the fast-moving world of 2016, 2017 business models. So we sat down and we said, we can either try to fix these problems one at a time, incrementally, or given the extent to which the regulations have in fact kind of fallen out of date and the speed with which the world around us is changing, we can try to take it all on at once, because many of the issues are interrelated. There's an issue in a regulation here, there's an issue there, they interact. So we decided to go bold, and as I said, to look at all the regulations. We've organized the regulatory consultation process around 4 phases. One on accessible transportation, one on the licensing of air carriers, one on consumer protection for air passengers, and one on freight rail issues. So 4 tranches of consultation. In each of those tranches, we are putting out a discussion paper, excuse me, trying to provoke questions, and engaging in a series of stakeholder meetings, discussions with experts, and public consultations as well. Of the 4, we expect the consumer protection for air travelers will attract the most attention from the general public. And so for that particular phase of consultation, we intend to actually open it up, hold public hearings, and even engage in crowdsourcing. We're thinking of online tools for the purposes of bringing in as much input from the public as possible. Ultimately, what we're trying to do through the Regulatory Modernization Initiative is to make sure that our regulatory provisions keep pace with emerging business models, keep pace with user expectations, shippers and consumers' expectations, and also reflect best practices in the regulatory field. Our hope is that at the end of all of this, we'll have regulations that are more streamlined, more performance-based, clear in terms of the expectations, the obligations of industry, but also no heavier than necessary in order to achieve public policy outcomes. So it's a very ambitious process. Our objective is to actually have it all done, all of the consultations, all the drafting, all the approvals by 2018. We started last year. So while in the world of private industry, a 2-year process for regulatory reform may still feel lengthy, for those of us who work in government, who have worked in government, to revise all of your regulations in 2 years and modernize them is blisteringly fast. I think one of the interesting questions for us, and one that this panel even helps to crystallize in my own mind, is once we're through the process, assuming we're successful, how do we keep the regulations from falling behind the times again? Because regulations by their nature are fixed, and industry innovation by its nature is dynamic. And so I think one of the things that we as regulators have to think about is, in order not to have to do this kind of a massive modernization process once every 2 or 3 decades, how do we become more nimble so that we can remain engaged with industry, remain engaged with stakeholders, understand what's happening out there, and keep the regulations fresh and relevant in a world that's moving much faster, oftentimes, than our rulemaking processes tend to move?
I think that's an essential point, because ultimately what we're talking about here are not making sure that the rules are adapted to what we see rolling out in cities and in countries, but making sure the processes with which we regulate are adapted to the uncertainty around some of these things that we're seeing emerge now and in the future.
Right.
Because of course, locking in regulations that make sense today will very quickly not make sense in a few years, and we can't anticipate that. So I'll come back to this issue of regulatory flexibility, but I want to turn to Roland. Roland, you are unique in this panel in that you have represented both sides of the regulatory border, if you will, having been state secretary for a while, and now on the other side representing a company that is best known for its disruptive effect of mobility markets in cities around the world. I wonder, is there something that from your own experience you would want to share on how we should think about governance of disruption, having seen both sides of the equation?
Yeah, first of all, it's really a very interesting journey for me, and having been working 5 years exactly here in the state of Saxony, where Leipzig belongs to, as a state secretary, I was very proud 5 years ago to draft a plan of future of mobility in Saxony 2025. And with my knowledge today, after 1 year with Uber, I have to admit that we have to redraft this already now. And what Scott Streiner said, I can't agree more that we have really to find rules, regs that are a little bit more flexible, because in the end, the rules have to lead a certain aim, and that's usually consumer protection. That is the aim, the core aim of most of these regs. And when in Germany, Uber has some challenges here also, has to obey some rules from 83, for example, as a famous return to garage rule. So if we would be able to offer a service here from a city center with our partner drivers to this conference center, after each trip, when they don't have a pre-booked trip again, they have to go back empty through the whole city, causing some emissions. So because in 83 there was another philosophy concerning emissions. And now we sit here, the friends and colleagues from the regulatory side, we have to find an interpretation. What was the lawmakers' will in 83 when this return to garage rule was put into German law? And that's definitely a huge challenge. But in the same aspect, I also already learned a lot that I'm communicating now to political, governmental levels, but also I'm communicating back into my own company. Because I think it's a process on both sides that we have to learn why regulators have to obey the rules and have to act according to the rules that they have. And we have to find a way with the modern technology to live with these rules and then work together in a dialogue like we have it here to modernize it. Because what I really learned is we are in such a fast-moving environment nowadays, and really we have to find ways to get to more flexible rules in order to serve best the consumer protection purpose. We talked about emissions. I believe with kind of carpooling, as you talked about, and we have carpooling in more than 30 cities in the world already. In some of these cities, we really pool already 50% of our trips, so meaning that out of 2 or 3 trips, we make 1. So we really reduce, in these cases, traffic and emissions, and it has also a good business purpose for us. But in Germany, for example, this is prohibited, because we are only allowed, according to the current law, to take one passenger or one party in one of our partner cars. And another aim, for example, road safety, a huge issue in Europe. The European transport ministers many years ago agreed on zero vision, so zero dead people in the roads. And we still have, I think worldwide every day around 3,000 dead people in road accidents. And so we see a very huge potential also there by, on one side, helping people to find other forms of mobility, so that, for example, in the evening when they go out, they use us or other options, public transport, whatever, instead of using their own car. And this could heavily help to improve also the safety on our streets. And so I really believe we have some very good things we could achieve together, but with the current regs, it's a very huge challenge.
I feel your pain. What I'm hearing is that you don't feel, and you're probably right in saying this, that governance frameworks are able to deliver outcome-based solutions, outcome-based results, because at various points they've been captured by different things, historic, for whatever reason. So if we're going to move to an outcome-based regulatory system, that's going, and that might free up and lessen some of the constraints on different commercial actors in that space, that's going to require some evidence from the commercial actors that those outcomes that public authorities want to and are mandated to deliver on are not going to be transgressed or eroded, so that erosion doesn't increase, so that monopoly effects don't increase. And clearly that's going to involve some communication of information, and some would say data sharing. I'm going to turn to Salida because, and ask you to put your other hat on right now, and I'll ask for everyone to answer, to build on what Salida says here, including Roland, because Uber has also done some things in data sharing recently that I'd like for you to talk about. But so Salida, this lightning regulation for better information about the impacts of these activities that you're in charge of regulating. NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, has just put out a set of guidelines on a minimum data ask that should be going to ride services. Now, it is a suggestion, but can you tell me what your thinking was behind that and how that helps cities, or how that may help cities lighten some of the constraints that Roland's just addressed?
Yeah, so that's not a loaded question at all. But I'll say, because, you know, we also put out a pretty feisty statement about data sharing, specifically the day that Uber launched something called Movement, which it claims is data sharing in certain cities where it operates. There's really two buckets of data that cities need. One is around safety. And having sat in rooms with companies that are experimenting with autonomous vehicles in different cities, they are extremely reluctant to share even basic safety data around something called disengagements. So how many times does the human driver have to intervene? How many times does the autonomous vehicle fail in a situation? What are those situations? How can cities respond by, either through infrastructure or through enforcement or regulation, but we can't even get basic data about disengagements. The second area of safety is really around who's operating the vehicle. Now, this is an area that I admit I'm not as invested in, but it is the dominant conversation among public policymakers, among electeds. Because a lot of ride-sharing companies refuse to submit their drivers to fingerprinting because that increases a barrier to driver access to the system. And those systems are successful fundamentally on the driver pool. How many drivers are available at any given time? That is a critical component of their success. So they don't want any barriers for people to drive the vehicle. Well, the state of Massachusetts just discovered through submitting drivers for Uber and Lyft to a second sort of pull test, so they have access to different databases than private companies do, that about 10% of the drivers for those companies either had felony convictions or lacked driver's licenses, right? So
Oops.
we know, right? But we wouldn't have that data. We wouldn't have that information if the public sector didn't provide a check on sort of private innovation, you know? And that's 10% is significant, but you know, we didn't submit them to fingerprinting to do that screen, right? So I would argue that it allows the public agency to have a sense of who's on the road without sort of compromising one of the core business principles of those private businesses. The other bucket of data that's really critical is around origin, destination, and the efficiency of the trip. So how many of these trips are really carpool trips, Uber Pool or Lyft line trips? And where is the demand for that service? And how many drivers or vehicles are on the streets of Los Angeles at any given time? When do they peak? When is it important? Where are those transit deserts that they're sort of filling in the blanks on? Where we can say as a public agency, okay, we're okay with these private actors filling in this blank over here, but this one here is where we already have robust transit service. Why isn't it working, and how could we make it work better? And the best we're able to get is really zip code to zip code aggregated origin destination data, which in a city the size of Los Angeles with zip codes the size of Los Angeles's is borderline useless, right? So that doesn't help me at all in sort of figuring those things out. The New York City Taxi Commission, which is the only city in the US that gets that kind of data from Uber and Lyft, did a deep dive and discovered that those companies are increasing vehicle miles traveled by about 7%, and they are increasing congestion in the outer boroughs, and they are taking trips off of every other mode, including public transit, rail, surface transit, biking, and walking, right? So I don't know if in that balance, that's really what we want to be doing. But we don't have that kind of information for Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., so it really sort of hinders our ability to both deliver infrastructure, deliver public transit as a public good and not for private profit, in an equitable way, and also provide a safe service that has a high level of consumer protection. So I think that there are solutions, but to date, there has been a very stubborn resistance to sharing data that would be useful to cities under anything other than a non-disclosure agreement, right? So I've gotten data from Uber and Lyft. I can't tell you about any of it, but I've gotten it, right? So how can we sort of strike a better balance in getting the data that we need without invoking, you know, trade secrets, which I think is a little bit of a smokescreen for other things that those companies may or may not want us to know.
So that is a very contentious issue. And as you can imagine, and I'm going to ask Roland and Raj to come in on where your companies see that. And I also want, Scott, for you to talk about some of the type of data that would make your regulatory efforts, regulatory relief efforts, more easy, especially when it comes to monopoly control of industry. But I wanted to raise two things here. And the first is clearly there are reasons why companies want to protect data. From their competitors, in some cases from regulators. I don't think that's something new. But there's another issue here too that points at a failure of governance, is because some of these new services that we're talking about do produce data, but a lot of the use of streets don't produce data that cities can use, or at least not in a timely way. So Salida, you are talking about New York, you're talking about Los Angeles, you could talk about Paris, you could talk about Leipzig. And a lot of these cities, most of the traffic on the streets are not taxis, they're not even public transport, they're cars. And we don't have a whole lot of ideas about what's actually going on there, except when we can do origin destination travel surveys, very expensive surveys every 10 years or more. Is it fair to ask the companies, because they can provide this information, to be the only ones to provide that information? Or is it a failure of government to not broaden the net and rethink about how do we get information about everything that's going on? That is a rhetorical question, but if you want to answer it, I think it would be helpful to hear from you. But first, I'd like to go back to Roland and maybe to Raj to talk about what do you feel comfortable sharing in terms of data? And Salita's made some strong arguments why there are some pieces of data that it would be essential for regulators to have to produce better outcomes. Roland?
I really loved your question, to be honest, but I think that's the story, because we are a digital company, but all the companies that started not being a digital company many years ago become more and more digital, and as you said, they also have data. They all have data already. Also the public transport companies have data. And so what you talked about with movement, it's a very new process that we started with this, and we are, I would like to admit, also a learning company. So we just had our 7th anniversary, and so we learned a lot already in the past, and we are still continuing to learn. And I think also on this dialogue, and you already said that you have some data, but some data then with an NDA, and so that makes it difficult for you to make this data public. But then there's also, not in Germany, but in the US, you see in the cities a very high competitive situation between different companies. So there are also some reasons that I can understand why my colleagues in California, for example, are a little bit modest on these issues sometimes. But what I would like to stress is really, and that's, I think, also new since a couple of years now, also with Uber, that we really seek partnerships. So we really like to partner with cities, with public transport. So we just talked about in Canada, a mid-sized city where the city decided to work together with Uber in order to increase the public network, to bring people to the railway station that they had, and they had no good public transport so far, and so they partnered. And we have in the US kind of a dozen partnerships, and even Europe we already talk about partnerships like this. And surely in partnerships like this there is quite a lot of data sharing then, because otherwise it would never work to bring people on the first mile and last mile, so on both miles, from and to networks of public transport. And so I think it's a story that will develop, but I can also understand that it's maybe not always so quick as some people would wish.
Raj, do you share Chariot data? Do you?
Let me give you the answer in 3 short stories.
Yeah.
You like stories?
I love stories.
Okay. So I'll give you 3 short stories.
All right.
And each of them has a completely different perspective on governance. So Chariot, thanks for asking the question. So the Department of Justice, and this is confidential, so don't share this broadly, okay?
Cut the cameras.
It's always best to say it in public, and it stays
Exactly.
confidential.
Hashtag
so when
Raj is talking.
yeah. So the Department of Justice said, you know, if you want to be in the ride-sharing business, right, you're taking 12, 14 passengers, your vehicle has to be equipped for wheelchairs, because all public transit allows wheelchair access. That's a business model killer for us, because you know, our Chariots run at full capacity. And if you have to put wheelchairs in there, we lose 4 seats per wheelchair. And then it takes more time to load and unload. So we had to share data with the DOJ showing them how are our rides being booked. The misconception was that we're competing with public transit in that we had fixed schedule, fixed route, and fixed capacity, which we did not. So they asked us to prove it to them. So sometimes data liberates you. Right, from the conversations. We're sharing the data with them. It took us a lot of time and effort to show them the data, to prove that we're a demand-responsive system. That someone requests it, then we pick them up and we move. And we provide an equivalent service for people that were in need. So that was the first story. The second story is around access. So when Salita says, show me the data that shows me, you know, transit micro-deserts, transit deserts, so that I can permit you or allow you to operate in those areas. It's actually a good thing to share the data, because in return we ask that the city give us access to bus lanes, that the city allows us to stop without being cited, that the city makes an effort to give us right of way. And this is a huge benefit to 12, 14 people sitting in one of the vehicles, that you can operate more freely than a car that's privately owned. So some cities are a little bit more forward-looking in that they will create, you know, lanes specifically for ride sharing. In other cities, they'll give us access to bus lanes. We're having conversations with Columbus, for example, is Smart City Challenge winner in the US to create such a system. So that's the second kind of quick answer. The third is to do with elderly travel. So if you think about the aging population, this population depends on transport to bring them to and from clinics. And it's very inefficient right now. The burden of that, cost of that journey is borne by Medicaid in the US. It's a huge number. It's $6 billion a year being spent on Medicaid reimbursed non-emergency medical transport. So for dialysis, regular visits. So we think through data sharing, data pooling, the ecosystem is bigger. It's not just transport governance, transport providers, but it's hospitals. And I think that's where we have to think about what is the data pooling that's required. Where are journeys, where is the demand for journeys predictable? And be able to aggregate that in a smart way. Because left alone, these people will take a vehicle and go there or request a Uber or Lyft, which is fine. But if you can get 2 or 3 people in that vehicle and get the appointment scheduled in a smart way, by data collaboration, everybody's fitness actually improves. Mm-hmm. This is not a winner-take-all model. Mm-hmm. This makes the whole system more efficient. So in our study, we discovered that whether we like it or not, in any mega city, the efficiency of the transport system is less than double digits. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's a fact. There's data that we've been gathering, which is astonishing. So I think if we do that data sharing and data pooling and create new business models with that data, it actually makes everybody more fit, whether it's profits for us, whether it's efficiency in the road transit network, whether it's better policy setting that advances the outcomes that the city really wants. So those are my 3 short stories. I hope you didn't mind that.
Those are excellent narratives, and they really frame the question well and provide some insights. Scott, I'm going to turn to you quickly to ask, how do you, in your processes, look at data? But I just want to make a quick shout out to another country, another northern country, but not in the same continent, Finland, that has just put in place a new deal, if you will, on regulating transport services, and has significantly deregulated a lot of their services in return for putting in place reporting requirements and access to APIs that help the agencies in charge of regulating those services understand that the activities that are now deregulated are not going against the public outcome. So there are a lot of models. That's the Finnish model that I've really briefly described. I would suggest you find someone from Finland to ask about. But Scott, can you tell us about how does data fit into your model for revisiting the regulatory framework of your agency?
Sure, happy to do so. So I think I would start by saying, the premise of the question, I think, and of the questions that we've been talking about is that one of the ways that we keep regulations, that regulations can keep pace with rapidly evolving business models, is to be more outcomes-based, more principles-based, as opposed to highly prescriptive. And I think in general that's a good premise. I would only, perhaps inevitably for a regulator, caution that if we make our regulations too outcomes-based, I'm not sure they actually achieve their public policy goal. I mean, at the end of the day, we have regulations to protect consumers, to protect users of the system, but also to create a predictable business environment and a level playing field for competitors. So we're certainly aiming through our initiative to take the regulations up a level and to make sure that they're not excessively prescriptive. And there's a role for data in that, which I'll come to in a moment. But I would just be careful that we don't exaggerate or overstate how far we can go towards purely principles and outcomes-based regulations, because I think that that can have unintended consequences, not only for the users, but for industry itself. So now to come to the question, I think there's no question that more data help us move regulations up towards principles and away from prescription. And I think they do so in 2 ways. First, for the regulator, having more data allows us to determine, A, are the regulations achieving their purposes? So if they're outcomes-based regulations, if we've got good data, we can actually determine whether or not goals are being accomplished. But they also allow us to undertake targeted interventions when something is going wrong. So that comes to the level playing field. If we have good line of sight into what's happening in the industry, and there is a player whose behavior is deliberately or inadvertently inconsistent with the objectives of the regulation, having the information allows us to take quick targeted action. In the absence of that information, the regulatory burden and the compliance burden is going to inevitably be higher, because we're going to have to inspect much more widely. I also think that to the extent that data can be made available not on an NDA basis, not on a confidential basis, but actually put into the public domain, it also has a disciplining effect. because then users who have access to data on system performance will actually take their business to the better performers, to those whose behavior is more consistent with overall public policy goals like consumer protection, and the market will become more self-regulating. So I think more data is useful both to the regulators, but it can also potentially be useful to market correction. Specifically with respect to us, I'll give you two quick examples. In the air sector, having more data on things like on-time versus delayed departures by various airlines would allow us to assess their performance against consumer protection targets, and it would allow consumers to make choices among airlines. With respect to the freight rail sector, having clear line of sight into the fluidity of freight rail services and pinch points within the system will allow us both to determine whether freight rail companies are delivering on their service obligations to shippers, but also to identify where within the freight rail system there may be blockages or there may be choke points that regulatory action or investment in infrastructure can help to correct.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to turn to Michael and ask a bit of a follow-up question on what we're hearing now. So outcome-based regulation, how far can that go? There are obviously some limits to that. But the question is more with the comfort level that both regulators and companies have in experimenting with regulation. Is there any basis, and would it be something that is interesting to pursue going forward, to be able to create a regulatory framework where people can, or companies and regulators can experiment with certain new types of arrangements and by doing that, escape from more constraining regulations that are currently in place. We've seen some evidence of this happening at a very local level in some cities around the world. But Michael, for the EU, where you represent or work for a body or are elected into a body that creates rules and guidance for all of the states in Europe, how comfortable would you be with providing some exemption framework to allow states to start experimenting with different regulatory approaches as a way of getting information about what seems to work best in areas where we don't have very much experience?
First of all, if there is an innovative company, they have to follow the law. And that was a problem with Uber at the beginning. They didn't care about law. We do what we like, and that is not possible. If a law is not followed, then you can forget law, and it must be followed. That is the first one. But we have the possibility for innovation for pilot projects. Mm-hmm. But they can ask, we want to make a pilot project in this direction, and of course, I'm very much in favor of such, because companies which are working for 10 or 20 years in the same issue, they are not innovative. That is a problem. So first of all, the law.
Okay, just on that specific point, because pilot projects I think are important, but can the pilot be for a rule or a regulation?
A pilot project is a project that is not necessary to follow the rule, because there's an exception of the rule. Mm-hmm. For example, if there is a taxi company, they said, okay, before we want to ask if some more people are coming with me, that is not in the taxi regulation, that could be a good perspective. But not only for Uber, but also for the normal taxi drivers. And as a consumer, I pay less when there are 3 or 4 persons in the car. Mm-hmm. In this direction, I'm very positive. Okay. The second one, with the data protection. There's my experience in Europe that is very bad, especially for my friends, the railways. Because it is not a problem to have an app to worldwide, each flight, you know where you can change, what is the price, and so on. That is totally transparent. But the railway companies, no, that is secret. Mm-hmm. But as a consumer, it is bad. We had, nearly 10 years ago, we made a European regulation that all the information in the railways you have Europe-wide. Up to now, it is not realized. And that is crazy, because they say, oh no, that is secret, and for business and so on. But I always said, okay, what the railways can, you must be able as well. So there we have to see that we want. Of course, there can be some data protection also for the consumers is very important. And what do they do with all the dates? We want to have also transparency. It can be profitable for the companies and for the consumers, and it must be transparent. And then in some cases you have to change the law, in some cases it is not necessary, but it must be transparent. That is for me the main issue for all the discussion we have.
Scott Salida, what's your comfort level with trialing regulations? Experimenting with regulations?
Very high.
High,
So, you know, I know we're in a room of mostly regulators, and we have been mostly speaking in defense of regulation up here. But I think that we also recognize that a lot of the regulations that we have hinder the kinds of partnerships that we want to achieve. So there are a lot of examples in Los Angeles where we're experimenting with different kinds of rules around procurement, for example, right? Which is one of the main, I would argue that cities have to be activist investors in the kinds of services and companies that move us iteratively towards our goal. And in order to do that, we have to be very comfortable with failure, and we have to be very comfortable taking thoughtful risks.
That is just crazy talk.
I know, I know. That's why you invited me, though, right?
Exactly.
But it's true, right? There is no reward for failure in politics, right? The reward is that your name is on the cover of the newspaper, that you tried something and it failed, and because, you know, we often work on a political cycle, that can have a chilling effect on innovation. But we have to be comfortable, you know, bending and playing with the rules. And sometimes we will succeed and sometimes we will fail, but we hopefully will be moving forward constantly towards the kinds of outcomes that we're really interested in, or whether it's resilience or equity or safety or any of those things. We must take risks because the status quo is not delivering what we want. And so we know that there are things about the status quo that we have to change, but the key is that word thoughtful risks. And in that, again, is a commitment to share data in an open way about our successes, but also about our failures, so that in a global sense, cities can be learning from one another and companies can be learning from cities in real time. If we are not comfortable letting go of the rules a bit, we'll never get there. And an example is one of the things that I regulate at LADOT is taxis, as well as non-emergency medical transport. And for decades, since we started regulating taxis in the 80s, we have had a driver exam, right? So if you want to drive a taxi in Los Angeles, you come downtown, you take this exam, and it was basically an English proficiency test, even though it disguised itself as a map reading kind of test. And so just a couple months ago, we eliminated it. We just got rid of the driver exam, and instead, what drivers need to do is take a course, a short course, in customer service. Because we want to change the value and the role of the driver in the car. Because we know that the role of the driver in the car is going to change in the future. But we also know that our driver exam was keeping people from driving taxis and also not necessarily resulting in good customer service in the vehicle. So that's a pilot where we removed a regulation and changed it to see if we could get a different outcome. And in the first month, we had a tripling of the number of people who came down to LADOT to apply to be taxi drivers. And we actually had a larger percentage of women as part of that pool, and that has been sustained over the months since we tried the pilot. So we know that it's working, at least on one of those kind of tranches of getting more people and more diversity of people and better qualified people in taxis in Los Angeles.
Excellent. I'm going to turn to Scott, but I also want to hear from Raj and Roland on this question. And then I'm going to turn it over to the room because I'm sure that many of you have some questions you'd like to ask our panelists. So Scott, you talked about outcome-based regulation, but what about trialing regulations? Because you've talked about how the other side, in this case represented by Raj and Roland, needs certainty.
Right. So I think that, you know, in the sense of trialing regulations, I think really, and I'll come back to what some of the other speakers said, what we're really talking about is exemptions. Like we will exempt players from certain regulatory requirements and see what happens. And I think that there's, I think that that's appropriate. It's something that we do from time to time, and I think it makes sense. But what you're really doing there, because regulations are structured to achieve certain policy outcomes, is you're actually testing if that provision is relevant anymore. when you exempt players or a particular player on a pilot basis or an ongoing basis for exemption from provision A, B, or C, the question you're asking is this serving any public policy purpose? Maybe it served a public policy purpose when we put it into place 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Let's try taking it away, at least for one player, and let's see whether or not the sky falls. Let's see whether or not the public policy purpose can be achieved without this or with a different variant on it. So I think there's lots of room for doing that. The other way that I think that we can encourage innovation is through regulatory interpretation. So this may not be true for some regulators in the room, but we certainly have scope, in fact, an obligation to interpret our regulations in light of broader policy purposes, and we can also reinterpret them. And I'll give you just a brief example of this. A business model that we saw emerging in the Canadian aviation context was a reseller model, where an air travel company would partner with a licensed air carrier in order to sell tickets to the public. So the public was buying services from the air travel company, but they were being flown by a licensed body. Historically, the reseller had been required to get a license from the agency because they were like an airline. And as we saw this model becoming more and more prominent and more experimentation going on, essentially we reached the conclusion that that was an unnecessary regulatory barrier to experimentation. So we carefully reinterpreted those obligations, and we said if you're reselling tickets, you're partnering with a licensed air carrier, and you're clear in your communication to consumers that you're not the airline and that their rights attach to the airline, not to you, we will remove the obligation for you to seek a license from us in order to free up the market and allow for more creativity, more innovation, and more consumer choice. That wasn't an exemption. That wasn't even a change in regs. That was a reinterpretation in light of an evolving business environment.
Excellent. That's a really good point. And what I like about that is, and you said it in your opening remarks, is that the number and volume of exemption requests should be a signal where we need to think about changing regulations. And Raj and Roland, if you've been hearing, that means that if you want to deal with some rules in Canada, then you should be asking for a lot of exemptions. Raj, how comfortable are you trading for more flexibility, less certainty in the regulatory framework in which you'll be operating your services?
Do you mind if I tell you a story?
Yeah, of course.
Right. So San Francisco is one of the few cities that requires employers to actually give you a transit allowance. It's not small, it's a lot of money. And the model is basically to encourage your employees to use public transit, Caltrain, BART, and all that, which accept that payment. So it's an onerous process that you have to, request for Caltrain pass. You get it. So we're seeing, to Salita's point, we're seeing companies like WageWorks that are emerging, that are creating these apps that capture the benefit and then allow mobile ticketing to take place on public transit. So I think, when we think about getting public transit to be more demand responsive, one of the bottlenecks is that they can't handle flexible payment, because the fare box is very difficult to convert a fare box to digital fare box. So we think that kind of innovation is key. There's an ecosystem of innovation, and there's a thread that converts all of these. So we're advocating that employers should be incentivized by cities or required by cities to provide mobility as a benefit to the employees, monetize it, and allow public transit to accept that as a form of payment using an employee badge or using an app. So we think that will drive a significant shift. We're seeing that happening in San Francisco because there's so much gridlock there. People just like the alternative. But it also provides the data that you were talking about, because by using this, companies can see, are they actually shifting behavior towards greater use of public transit? And it drives the positive outcome I think we're looking for. So as long as the bottleneck that public transit and shared rides can accept that form of payment without friction, I think adoption will be very high. We are being increasingly trained to expect digitization of everything, right? To go and line up to buy a ticket or to then take that stub and submit it for reimbursement. That's all friction. And millennials in particular have a very low tolerance for that.
And I know that you've been pushing these type of requests and trying to find more and more of these solutions with cities these win-win situations. Roland, in a company like yours that is always changing, how comfortable are you with having less certainty about the regulatory framework in return for more flexibility in developing business models?
First, I think, and also I got used to a very, very dynamic and flexible environment and fast-moving situation. What we see now in more than 500 cities where we are currently operating, we have in every city, even if in some countries we have a federal framework, then in some variations we have in every city a different framework, a different product in some aspects. It's also often a cultural question that, for example, in some countries, in some cities are more focused on cars and other cities more focused on bikes. And so there's really a lot of variety and diversity. But and I'm a huge fan of kind of experimental possibilities that you can try to do a test in another city. And we are doing this in our company. So we start a product, we start an idea in a city, then we make our experience, we develop it a little bit further on, we go to 5 other cities, and that's also how we were growing. That by doing, trying, making errors, learning out of it, and moving ahead. And I think that's a very dynamic, very interesting way. But on the other side, we also have some regs where I really believe we don't have to prove anymore that it's maybe not such a big need, that in some cities, taxi drivers are still forced to have a paper copy of a city map, maximum 3 years old, in their car, while at the same moment we talk a lot about autonomous vehicles. So I always wonder, and I heard a lot in the last 3 days also about autonomous vehicles, and I always wonder how these autonomous vehicles will make the city knowledge test in some cities in Europe, where they still usually, the driver has to learn 5, 6, 7, 800 street names in a city. So I think there are some things we can just change now. Other things we have to make experiments, where we have to learn, where we have together with scientists, with cities, with authorities, find and make our experiences. But I really believe we have to move a little bit faster. That's, again, what I learned in my previous job, knowing that sometimes in administration you have a little bit more time than when you're in a competitive situation with competitors. But I believe in all of our societies, in order to really make these benefits out of digitizations achievable for the citizens, improve the quality of life in citizens, hopefully reduce congestion in cities and emissions, hopefully increase road safety, I really believe we have to move a little bit faster.
Excellent. I'm going to turn it over to our audience for some questions, but we have microphones on both sides of the room. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you to finish after these questions with your feeling on 1 or 2 words that best describe the principles that you feel should guide governance in this area. So that gives you some time to think about. 1 or 2 words, what should be the values that are guiding governance in this area? All right, so now we're going to turn it over to the audience. Now, anyone who knows me, and certainly my 2 daughters know that I am not very strict, but I will be very strict. I'm going to ask that you ask a question, not make a speech, and I will interrupt you, I'm sorry in advance, if you start doing that, because we don't have a lot of time and many people will want to talk. So let me first come over, I see here, and then I'll come back to, introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you for the conversation. My name is Katie Salomati. I'm with SAS Institute, and I'm quite an Uber user. But I wanted to ask, in some cases, I see that drivers, the Uber drivers, because I talk to my Uber drivers, and I hear that in some cases they see a canceled trip, or they're driving idle around to get a customer, and I keep thinking this adds to the emission and to the congestion. So is there going to be any study or research to understand how much and what is the balance in Uber driving that increases the congestion and increases the number of idle travels compared to just having a taxi standing by? Because in this case, the Uber driver might be a winner and the user might be a winner, but really the city is the loser because they're just having more drivers going around and adding to the congestion and traffic.
Before you answer, I'll just make a request that when we ask questions specifically about, in this case, Uber, we also remember that Uber is one of many, many companies in a crowded sector providing ride services. So if you could answer your question also more generally about how do we deal with this issue for all ride service type of companies. I'll take one more question, and then we'll go. So one more question on this side, here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Andrzej Maciejewski. I'm from Poland. And I have a question. Do you like stories? Yes.
I think we've established that I like stories, but I want a short story now.
Okay, but it will be a question, I think, for Europeans. Do you think that because we are talking about new business models, new services, and all of these new business models and new services may be based on data exchange, and we are now facing the challenge of private data protection with a new EU directive. Do you think it will have some good or bad impact on these new business models? Because I think working as a public authority, that when we will have this new directive, then we will have much less data to share than much more. And I think this is a challenge when we are talking about new business models and new services.
Two questions. How do we evaluate the impact of ride services? And in the European context, how can new rules that are being and have been put in place on data, and data restrictions because of privacy, will that have an impact on the way in which these new business models can develop? So whoever wants to speak on that first or last.
Sure, why not? So I think that, at least to the first question, how do we evaluate new business models? One idea which we're starting to test is this idea of something that we call data escrow, where an academic institution which is not subject to Public Records Act requests, right? So they're not going to be compelled to provide data to the public, can get data from ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft and do evaluations for certain cities. So working with the National Resources Defense Council and University of California, they're looking at 3 US cities and getting data and doing original survey work. And so in some ways, partnerships with academic institutions can help us overcome sort of an interim hurdle in trying to gather information and evaluate things, which adds a degree of third-party credibility, as well as some reassurances that the data shared will not become public. But I did want to just mention to your question specifically, when we compared the efficiency of Uber and Lyft to the efficiencies of our taxi cabs, Uber and Lyft are almost 3 times as efficient in terms of how often the vehicle is circulating without a ride in the car. And that's partly a function of regulation, because in Los Angeles, you can be permitted to drive in Los Angeles, but not in Beverly Hills. So you might be able to drive and drop off a passenger in Beverly Hills or Santa Monica, but you cannot pick up one and return. But the second is really the way that those ride-sharing companies have changed the game. They are constantly tooling their app to compel driver efficiency, to the point where drivers are getting, queued for rides before the one in the vehicle has ended. So I think that there are ways for us to evaluate them, and at least initial data is that they are very efficient, and a lot of lessons we could learn in the transit and taxi field to sort of improve on those metrics.
Michael and Roland, do you also have some things to say about this?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, because we have to reduce the number of cars. That must be the goal, that we have more space for the people in the cities. And therefore, if there is an experiment that you have more traffic jam, although it is good for the consumers and for the companies, that is not the right way. So we have to look at it, and therefore, pilot projects are new experience. You have to look at it very carefully, and if it is in a good way, you can repeat it and enlarge it. And if not, you have to stop it and to think over. Because taxis belongs to public transport, and public transport, that is very important for saving mobility for the future, but in the right way.
Roland?
Yeah, also to the question on the idle, I think that's exactly what we are working on day by day, because our business model is focused on increasing efficiency. That's a good business case, should be a good business case. And the side effect is also it reduces other negative external factors like, for example, emissions in the best case and congestion. And so we are really working on this app on day-by-day basis and even including those who like to go from A to B. So maybe you experience it already in the app that sometimes you can see, okay, the app tells you you are here you can get a trip in 3 minutes, but if you walk 100 or 200 meters around the block, then the car doesn't have to circle around the block, can pick you up easier, so it's less idle. And again, it's less traffic because it doesn't have to circle around. And that's really the whole story in the end, increasing efficiency. Concerning data protection, I believe this European Data Protection Directive is helpful because it helps us in Europe to have a common standard. And all operations in Europe are based and operated via our Amsterdam European Middle East Africa headquarters. So it gives us a certain European standard of data protection that's extremely important, I believe. And when it comes to data sharing, I think it's not such a huge problem as far as we can share data that is obeying this privacy rules by aggregating these data in order to learn which kind of transport patterns are existing. And I believe, especially as a tech company, this data privacy is really the core of our business also because it's really absolutely necessary for us. And so I believe with this European directive, it really brings a lot of clarity in it.
All right, let's ask for 2 more questions. I'll go to the back of the room. So over here on the aisle, 1 question. Anyone else have a question? Please raise your hands high. Oh, okay. Over here.
Hello, thank you. My name is Milcha Steliu. I work for the International Association of Public Transport. So I have a question, just to give you a little bit of the background. We were really heavily involved in the negotiation of the new urban agenda last year in Quito. So this is a little bit of where this question is coming from. You've been talking quite a lot about regulation and how to make it nimble. And one of the main points that came out of that discussion was that more and more of the regulation has to be taken over and done also at city level. So a way of making regulation more nimble is to introduce it and think about it closer to the citizens. So the first question, and I think I was missing this in the panel, is how do you actually work towards making sure that the public policy goals from the national levels get to be relatively aligned with what you see as the goals at the local level? So that's my first question.
That is and I'm sorry, it'll be the only question because we have other people. But thank you for that question. And we'll take another question right here and keep this one in mind because we'll go back to that.
Hi, I'm Manuel from the University of Linz. I had precisely the same question, so I'll ask a different one.
Sit down.
No. So I'll pick on that. London has 33 boroughs. Each borough has a different parking regulation. How do you deal with different policies at different levels? This is directed to the companies, but also to the policymakers. How do you make sure that this is streamlined across the nations and so that cooperation works better that way? Thanks.
How do you deal with cross-jurisdictional issues? Are rules as close to the citizens as they should be, as you feel they ought to be? Obviously, urban and national included. What's your opinion on that?
Of course, it would be great if we have a European regulation, but that is not possible because I come from Germany, and even in London, in the city you have not a single regulation. And even if in the Bundesländer, between Berlin and Potsdam, we have big problems, or Berlin and Brandenburg, with the airport, what is with the taxis. So let us going down. If we solve it in the countries, then we can go to the European level. But then we have a lot to do to make it in a country.
Scott.
So I will answer. It's not in the context specifically of Uber and of cities, but I do come from the federal level of one of the most decentralized federations in the world. Yep. And I would make 2 observations. One is that generally speaking, policymakers and regulators are pursuing the same public policy goals. And so many of the differences, much of the diversity that we observe is in how they choose to translate those public policy goals into specific rule sets. And I think at least our experience in Canada is that if you can convene the right kinds of discussions between policymakers and regulators around objectives, you can oftentimes move from that into an agreement to align the specific rule sets. So you kind of have to take the discussion first to the level of purpose, but with an understanding at the outset that the objective is going to be maximum alignment, because that allows the market to function smoothly. It irons out differences, and it creates, in our case, a more coherent federation. I don't want to suggest that this works in all areas and all the time, and it certainly requires an investment of time and energy. But I think we've got a pretty decent record in Canada of those kinds of intergovernmental discussions leading to greater coherence. On the other side, from the national level, if that doesn't work, we in Canada always have the advantage of spending power. So higher level, higher order governments can always use carrots and sticks around funding in order to encourage greater alignment at the provincial and city levels. I know some of my colleagues may not like the sounds of that, and the government of Canada is always careful not to be overweening in this regard, but national governments do have some tools at their disposal to help to encourage greater alignment where that doesn't happen through the natural course of events.
Raj?
I'm just going to borrow, something that we all use all the time is the smartphone. So to answer your question about the borough of Islington, so we're doing a project there with GoPark, the system we built for the borough, and GoRide. So the idea is that when you use your smartphone in different cities, you're not concerned about how it's finding a signal. You're not concerned about how well it's going to perform. The expectation is that it'll adapt to that environment. So I think the onus is on us to create highly adaptive business models and not use the excuse of country-level regulation, city, municipal boundaries, county lines as an excuse to deteriorate performance. We have to be highly adaptive in how we design these things. I think if you build one size fit all and scatter that idea all over the world, at any point in time, somebody's going to be annoyed with you. I mean, by just definition. So I think we have to design the system, and that's why I give you the analogy of the smartphone. It's been designed with that philosophy in mind that you can use it any way you want. You don't have to learn the local systems.
Salita?
I was just going to say, I think it's really important to get regulation at the right level. And this is a really relevant conversation in the United States right now because the NHTSA and the Federal Highways Administration, USDOT, are working on a set of rulemaking around autonomous vehicles. And there's a very strong push by auto manufacturers and software companies to preempt local control. So to have a nationwide set of regulations to avoid what's become kind of a dirty word, which is a patchwork regulatory environment, which I understand completely. We were talking about certainty and predictability. On the other hand, in the United States at least, when we have tried to write regulations at a national level, typically they have really fallen apart and failed cities. So design guidelines that work in rural Maine completely fall apart in downtown San Francisco, right? Because the context is so important. And around autonomous vehicles, I would argue that this is even more true, for long-haul freight or long-haul passenger autonomous vehicles that operate on rural roads or freeways. One set of regulations makes sense, crashworthiness and all the rest. But at a city level, we're very interested in lightweight vehicles that can't travel very fast. And so, because we have goals around safety, we were talking about Vision Zero earlier, Los Angeles experienced a 40% increase in fatalities just last year, and we're on track this year to outpace last year, right? So safety is a really, really critical thing for us, but at the national level, pedestrians weren't even included in the Highway Safety Manual until very recently. So I think that, and I would just say this as politely as I can, I don't know that at the current moment, cities want to bring national policy goals down to the municipal level. So I think that they're both from a design perspective, a context perspective, there's a need to push back against this sort of desire to have national regulation, particularly for technology and transportation.
context is important. Roland?
So already in your country, I think they have 8 different regulations in each of the states in Austria, and then an Austrian regulation, it doesn't fit into each other also sometimes. And so I really believe, personally, I'm a true believer in federalism, and I believe it's also a good way of how entities, municipalities, countries, states can find the best way. What I would wish a little bit from the EU, for example, because knowing that the EU in transport aspects not always has the only saying, it's very national issue still, but I would wish to have institutions like EU, and the ITF is doing it already, that's why we have a panel like this here, try to find best practices and promote best practices, because I think we can learn all from each other. That's how we do it in our company. We try to talk to colleagues, learn about the Finnish example, Estonian, Lithuanian examples, and so on, and then try to convince others in other countries to maybe adapt some similarities. And very important for the consumers, what Mr. Rao just said, when you open the app, your Austrian version of the app, if it's in Canada or Russia or in Rio de Janeiro, it's always in your language. So for you as a consumer, it's always in the end more or less the same experience you can make.
Thank you. We have run out of time, but I did ask a question, and so I'm going to do a quick round robin and canvass you for 1 or 2 words, a 1 or 2 word story for you, Raj, that embodies the values that you feel should be embodied into the governance of these new mobility models.
I think it's purposeful collaboration.
Purposeful collaboration, excellent. Scott?
Balanced between the various stakeholders and responsive to the changes underway.
All right.
I would say social equity, deep well-being, and safety.
All right.
Fair competition.
Perfect.
I would say put citizens first, so the rule is not the core aim. The core aim is really the consumer and the citizen, and how he is best served and how his situation is improved best.
And the follow-up question, did any of you disagree with anyone else's core values? No. So that's remarkable. Then there is some agreement on where we should all be going. And with that, I'll finish this panel. Thank you for attending this. We have a number of other events still going on, and I think, oh, here we go, that are shown up here. And I do want to say one thing, that there is a lot of information that went into this. A lot of that information will be available on the website for this panel, including the Urban Mobility Plan that Los Angeles has put out, and some excellent videos that Ford Mobility has produced, both on their Street Ranger program, but also on the Price Tag the Street initiative. I really suggest you go look at those because they're quite inspiring. Thank you very much, and thank you. And a round of applause for